The final shape weapon tuning preview has been released, and for those of you that are planning to work these into your builds when going into the day one raid, or just wanting to be prepared, I have all of the important notes that you need to know from this preview. I will leave it down in the description if you want to read along, or if you want to see the parts that I skipped. Mostly just quality of life changes, because those don't really affect the main game as we're playing it, so that's just kind of how I'm going to be doing this. If you want to know what all the changes are, just head into the description and I will have that for you. To start, let's start off with weapon specs. All of those weapon spec mods like boss spec, minor spec, all that stuff, they're all being retired effectively when Final Shape comes out. All of their buffs are being applied to every weapon in the game in PvE, alongside all of the buffs we are about to go into later. They shouldn't be applied to weapons that are already currently really powerful, think your rockets and stuff like that, and also recently buffed weapons, so don't expect things like the 1K to be getting that 7% damage buff as well. However, they will be changing those as time goes on, so we'll see what those buffs apply to later. Exotic primaries have had their damage reduced from 40% to 30%, other than Fighting Lion, because it's a special little boy. It does nothing, basically. That damage decrease won't really do much, considering that all of these buffs that we're about to go over, and that damage spec mod buff as well that will be applied to those weapons going forward. Let's talk those damage buffs now. They have separated them into damage buffs to all combatants, to minors, to majors, and so on. So let's start with the damage buffs to all combatants across the entire game. Pulse rifles have an increased damage of 20%, with exceptions like Graviton, Revision Zero, and stuff like that. Those are insane changes. 20% is a big deal, especially when pulse rifles aren't even that bad. They're making this change in response to their performance in high-end content like your master raids and your GMs. That 20% buff is nothing to sneeze at. That is a big deal. So if you have a good blast furnace, you're going to be eating well come Final Shape. Pellet shotguns have had their damage increased by 10%, with exceptions of the obvious like Legend of Acreus, Tractor, Conditional Finality, Fourth Horseman. All of these weapons are working as intended, so they don't need that buff. All of your shotguns that aren't that will get 10%. Pretty cool. Slugs will have their damage increased by 9%. Fusion rifles plus 7%, exceptions being 1K voices because they just hate 1000 voices for some reason. Sniper rifles have had their damage increased by 7% as well, with that not applying to Izanagi's Burden when at max stacks and to the Cloud Strike's Storm. Base damage, they will have that 7% increase, but when you are activating their perks, they will not, so keep that in mind when using them for your loadouts. Glaive projectiles. God, glaives are so funny. I love glaives, but God, they are not good in the slightest. They have had their projectile damage increased by 7%. Now, for things like the Hunter exotic glaive, that's a big deal because that just got Jolt. So if that applies through the Jolt, it is very powerful. Add the Crab Claws from the Hunter, and you've actually got a pretty decent glaive build. But glaives are just not good, period. I hate to say it because I'm a glaive simp. It doesn't work, but hopefully that 7% buff makes some glaives better than others. Sorry for the glaive rant. Linears will be getting a 5% damage buff as well to all combatants. Moving on to buffs towards minor enemies, those big your red bars, these will stack with all prior listed PvE damage buffs, so all the ones I just read above will stack with these. Sidearms, trace rifles, scouts, and bows have had their damage increased all by 20%, so all of these are going to be incredibly good. Agger's Scepter should be getting this buff as well, making it even more of a powerhouse. If you haven't seen my video where I test all of the trace rifles on the dungeon bosses, that video is still kind of accurate. With these buffs though, it's going to be completely blown out of the water. I'm gonna have to do all of my retesting, so that'll be fun, I guess. It does small plug, sorry about that. Moving on, auto rifles and pulse rifles will also be getting a 15% damage increase on top of the ones that they just got above, so that's pretty good. If you're looking for the exact number when you're adding up both of the buffs, it'll be around 38% since they do stack multiplicatively. God damn. Submachine guns will have a damage buff of 10%, and hand cannons will get a 5% damage buff. I hope that 5% makes them a little bit more potent, especially in the 120 and 180 varieties, because 140s are just the best archetype for PvE, so I hope that pushes 180s and 120s just a little bit higher. Moving on to damage increase to majors, these being your yellow bars and your champions. And the only thing being buffed in this category will be trace rifles, which is an increase of 20%. My god, they are really trying to make trace rifles good again. Damage increases globally, this includes PvP. Machine guns will have their damage increased by 7%, and swords will have their damage increased by 7% as well. That is all of the damage buffs at this current moment, looking pretty good. I'm noticing that pulse rifles might be a little bit more dominant now with just how good they can be. With that 38% damage buff, that's a big deal. So we'll see how that rolls out when we get to it. So let's talk about some nerfs, because there are plenty. Splash damage nerfs to various exotic weapons. Your sunshots, your Trinity ghouls, your Polaris lances, your gravitons. They've all had their splash damage reduced by 10%. Kinetic weapons have had a nerf as well. Kinetic weapons will no longer deal increased damage to boss tier enemies. That is a pretty big blow to things like Izanagis and your Arbalists and whatever. That's a really big deal. Other tiers remain unchanged. It's just boss tier enemies, but that's a big deal. That is actually just 15% less damage in your rotation. So things like Izanagi's Burden are going to be struggling. Okay, maybe not struggling. It's still probably going to be the best option for a lot of rotations like your rockets. But minus 15% damage in any way is just pain. That just hurts. Moving on, we have a small buff to low reserve snipers. Their ammo is being increased from 14 to 17. Think your successions, stuff like that. Waveframe grenade launchers. It's been a long time coming, man. They were eventually going to get a nerf, and this is kind of a half and a half. There's a bit of a buff here, bit of a nerf. Let's start with what I personally believe to be more of a buff, and that being the blast radius changes that go along with it. Blast radius, as of the final shape, will now scale the size of the wave that you're shooting. The current cap for blast radius on wave frames is 100, but that 100 is being set down to 50 as a baseline. So we still have that technical 100 stat, it's just being put into the number that is 50. Now anything above that 50 number will increase the height and width of the wave that you're shooting when final shape comes around. So if you have a 100 blast radius wave frame like I do, that'll be set down to 50, and anything above that 50 will increase the size. To compensate for this change, they have reduced the length of the wave from 22 meters to 15 meters. The only wave frame that will be spared from this will be Dead Messenger, but as far as every other wave frame goes, that is how the new waves are going to be scaled up through blast radius. I believe this is more of a buff than a nerf, seeing as a wider wave just means you hit more things per shot, so I personally think it's just a bit more of a buff. Moving on, we have the exotic weapon changes, of which there are a lot. I'm going to be skipping over quite a few, seeing as they are just quality of life changes or just changes to things like handling or how the weapon feels. That will be completely up to you if you want to read up. Again, the article is in the description if you want to read all the things that I'm skipping over. Starting with Divinity. Now, this is going to cause a big shitstorm on Twitter, I can already tell. What they are doing is shots required to generate the quote-unquote cage that Bungie calls it, the big bubble, has been increased by 75%. This is in PvE only, of course. But an increase of 75%, that means you have like a mag and a half less ammo than you normally would when using Divinity. That's a big deal. You are required to run reserves if you are going to be running Divinity, and that hurts. We'll have to see how these changes really affect people using Divinity, seeing as there are a lot of bosses that just have really hard to hit crit spots, and it's just better to have a Divinity on them. We'll have to see if this changes people's builds or their willingness to use Divinity at all. It remains to be seen, so we'll just have to wait and see. Moving on from Divinity, I'm just going to be going rapid fire. Symmetry's Catalyst will now provide a 10 reload speed, 10 handling, and 80 current has been implemented into the weapon, so that's pretty nice. Touch of Malice will now have an increased duration for the Catalyst's projectile burn from 2 seconds to 3.5 seconds. Osteostriga will now have a 4-second internal cooldown in between poison bursts. When you kill an enemy and you cause poison to happen, you will get a 4-second cooldown. This does not affect poison bursts caused by sustained damage, it is only from final blows, so don't worry about that. Necrochasm has gotten a complete rework for the most part. An intrinsic perk will now buff reload speed after headshot kills. The burn duration from cursed thrall explosions will be increased from 2 to 3.5 seconds, and the catalyst has been rebuilt. 1 for thrall, damaging 3 combatants in quick succession, provides a period of increased damage, range, and aim assist. I don't know if that's better than just what we have right now, but there you go. If you like Necrochasm, it's been rebuilt, and it seems like it's pretty good. Lament has gotten itself a bit of a nerf. Its healing has been reduced by 20%. Reduced damage on high-end chained heavy attacks by 20%. This meaning if you are doing a full combo, the very final heavy attack that you do in that combo will have 20% less damage. It shouldn't affect lower stacks and those types of combos too much. It should be largely unaffected. But that healing is still a pretty big deal, considering a lot of bosses now do a shit ton of melee damage, so we'll see how Lament fares. Dead Man's Tail, stacks of Cranial Spike will increase all aspects of the weapon's feel and damage, as well as granting more buffs to hipfire accuracy and aim assist. This is to give it more of that gunslinger vibe with the hipfire and all that. Hopefully it doesn't dominate PvP too much, but I imagine it will. The Colony, but you guys haven't heard that name in a long time. Final Blows will now spawn additional insect robots, up to 5, with higher tier enemies increasing the amount of robots spawned. So now you just have a mini robot army to put on your Threadling build. Hooray. Truth is a rocket launcher that hasn't existed since Gambit died. They have increased the AoE damage by a certain amount they haven't specified, and they have made sure that this will not affect the impact damage too much, and they have also increased the reserves by 3. So for the 5 people that still use Truth, you are eating good come final shape. Queenbreaker's Bow. This probably has less users than Truth does. Its damage was increased by 12% versus all high tier enemies, that being champs, bosses, vehicles, etc. And the reserves were increased by 3. I don't know who the hell is using Queenbreaker's Bow, but I guess we'll find out when these buffs roll around. Bastion has a completely reworked perk called Saint's Fist. Dealing damage with melee increases your charge rate, damage, and reload speed for a short duration. This will also have the added effect where landing a majority of your pellets in a burst will increase your melee damage. This has a lot of potential to be broken if the damage buff is high enough, especially with Wormgod's Caress. Hopefully Bastion doesn't break the game too hard. Ariana's Vow has gotten a bit of a buff where breaking a solar shield will cause an ignition. That's pretty cool. Deterministic Chaos, which is the machine gun that I use exclusively for my Void builds, it now has anti-barrier intrinsically, and the alternate shots have been swapped. So instead of a weaken every 4th shot, you will have volatile every 4th shot, and vice versa for the weaken on the 16th. That's pretty good. Having a lot more volatile in my builds is always nice for those void breaches, so I cannot complain in the slightest. On to the final stretch, we have the perk changes. This is the one I had to cut down the most, seeing as a lot of perks were just duration increases, bug fixes, stuff like that. So I'm just going over the big ones that I thought were important in my line of work, that being PvE. Chain Reaction, which is the big deal for a lot of PvE players, seeing as it's kind of been dominating every single loadout I have ever used in the past year and a half. Chain Reaction will now be changed based on if it's on a special weapon or a heavy weapon. If it's on a special weapon, the AoE and damage is being reduced by 15% and 20% respectively. The heavy weapons, however, will have their AoE damage remain the same, with a 30% damage buff on top of that. So if you are using a heavy grenade launcher with Chain Reaction, you are just going to be doing better than most people's forbearances, which is going to make a lot of people very, very mad. Now that I believe to be the biggest one out of all of these changes. Moving on from that, we have Eddy Current. It will now take 1.5 seconds to activate with a bonus to handling with a 5% scalar on each stat at base. So all of your stats will be affected by Eddy Current by 5% per stack. And Amplified will give you max stacks, so you don't even need to worry about the whole sprinting around thing if you just shoot things, so that's pretty good. Underdog, completely removed. It's not in the game anymore, and they've replaced it with Pulse Monitor. Osmosis and permeability have been kind of on the wayside because matching shields doesn't really matter anymore, but they have given it a bit of a buff where every time it's activated, it will partially reload your weapons on activation, and it will properly mimic your grenades if you were on strand or stasis. So for those builds, very good. Chill Clip. Now this is specifically aimed at those fusion rifles, not the rockets or anything like that. They've adjusted the number of shots required to freeze by the archetype of a weapon. For example, rapid fire fusions still require 3 shots to proc, things like your Riptides. Slower firing fusions like Deliverance will only require 2. So for those situations, very good. Very happy my Deliverance is now not garbage anymore. Very awesome. Now for the final change in this big fuck off notepad I made, High Ground. It has been reworked completely where it will provide stacks of damage a la Rampage every time you get a kill, but dealing damage above a target will grant max stacks, and the damage has been increased, so the max you can get is 25% in PvE and 15% in PvP. Not bad at all. I hope you all enjoyed my giant 16-minute-ish long rant on a giant wall of text. I hope this was informative. I hope that you feel more prepared to go into the final shape. This will be a big deal for those of us that are trying to do the raid day 1 or even compete in the race, so I hope you are taking notes. Thank you so much for watching. Do all the algorithm stuff, like, comment, subscribe, do whatever. I don't care. I just appreciate you watching. So, yep, that'll be it for me. Thank you so much, and I will see you all later.